I'm almost an older man here now. I can't have that relentless pursuit every single day without a sacrifice of some sort. And that sacrifice can come in many ways. It can come in time, it can come in energy, it can come in relationships, it comes in every single form. And as a man now, it's very hard to compete with the younger ones, but again, I'm so happy with that because I know in my heart that I could have done more. I could have done more. And
sport is the ritual sacrifice of human energy. Those are the words of David Sansone, whose book, The Genesis of Sport, I read recently and was just fascinating. I'll explain what that means in a minute, but I think what I want to talk about today is where does sport come from and why is it such a difficult word? Recently, I was out doing some outreach events for the museum I work at, and we had a board saying, should these things be Olympic sports? Are these things Olympic events? One of the options was dance, and pretty much everyone agreed that yes, dance is a sport. But the other two that really interested me were music and art. Because music, actually most people said yes. Music is as much a sport as dance. It should be an Olympic sport, great. But art was so divisive. We're talking painting and sculpture here. But what's most interesting is why it was divisive. Those under the age of 10, they already thought that art was a sport, or they were pretty quickly persuaded once we pointed out why music and not art. But those who were older, adults mostly, not only did they reject this out of hand, they seemed genuinely, personally offended I would even suggest that art would be a sport. And I think it's 50% artists thinking that sport is beneath them, and 50% sports people thinking art isn't cool and athletic and strong enough to be sport. Which is bizarre because sport, as having this very athletic, physical activity idea, didn't really exist until relatively recently. David Sansone suggests that sport actually, pretty much only in English, has this meaning of athleticism, and that most languages actually borrow the English word sport precisely because of this. Now, we always need to be careful with exceptionalism because everyone loves thinking their country is the first and only one to do this. But certainly it does seem true. When we look at the ancient world and the ancient Olympics, their word for the Olympic Games was agones, which is the same word they use for trials and military combat and art competitions. So there wasn't this division in the ancient world. Even in Shakespearean times we see this. He describes acting as sporting on stage. Hell, today we call people good sports if they just have fun. We might sport around with people when we play with them. Sport, until very recently, meant leisure. It meant anything that wasn't work. And it was only really with the Victorians who decided to start categorizing everything and putting everything into niche little groups and redefining things that sport gains this new meaning. When you look at what is and isn't a sport, it's a very, very blurred line. Anyone who knows me knows that I think words are difficult and definitions are pretty meaningless. It is incredibly hard to define something, anything. Defining a chair is a back and forth battle, right? So defining something as nebulous and difficult as sport is never going to happen. And that's because human brains don't work in definitions. Human brains work by taking a bunch of stuff and comparing them, getting a general image of what we think about, and saying, yeah, that's it. I mean, this is what Plato's talking about with Platonic forms. The idea that there is an ideal tree, an ideal chair, an ideal sport, and everything we see that we describe as tree or chair or sport is reflecting some aspect of that ideal tree that exists in our mind. So the question is, what is that ideal sport that exists in people's minds? Is it necessarily about physical athleticism? Well, shooting. I would say air pistol shooting isn't that physical. Chess. I mean, the Olympic Committee thinks chess is a sport. That's not that physical. Is it then about teamwork, about sportsmanship? Well, there's loads of single events, individual events. Okay, so is it something that is competitive? It has to be a competitive thing. You can only do it competitively. Well, then what about dance, which is in the Olympics, surfing and skating? What about, any athletics, which can be done entirely individually? Okay, how about a competition which has a very set and clear amount of criteria to judge it? Art is too nebulous, it's too difficult, we can't have art because how would you judge it? Well, again, what about all these performative ones? What about surfing and BMX? All of these are done by judges, and it's up to their opinion. It's opinion as to who wins these. And yes, there are points for technicals and fouls, etc., but it is opinion that rules the roost. I mean, look at the boxing this year at Paris. A number of British athletes have gone out, boxed, and been dismissed despite everyone thinking they were going to win on the judges' score, because the judges decided something that no one else saw. Their opinions were different to the prevailing opinion. Let's talk about what this phrase then means, a ritual sacrifice of human energy. What about sport is ritual? It's not really religious in any way, but ritual isn't necessarily religion. We need to think of ritual as a much broader thing. Ritual is tradition. And what we mean by that is something which may once have had a purpose, but is now done for its own sake, for the sake of doing it. We can see this in our everyday lives. Traditions are everywhere. Look at the Houses of Parliament. They run on rituals and traditions that aren't necessarily religious, but also don't really have any meaning. Perhaps the best example is cargo cults. So these were Pacific Island nations where there were air bases. And cargo would come in for the air bases and they'd give some to the locals. And then when the airports moved out, when the air bases moved out, the people there recreated them. They made wooden planes and buildings. They painted figures from comic books on their shields because they wanted those boons, those gifts to come back to them. That's what ritual and tradition are. They are a removal from the original purpose, but keeping the form. And this is something we see a lot in the Greek period, in the rituals that go on. We might look at nudity. So there were certain rituals that supposedly sowing beans would be more fertile if you did it while naked. Why? Madness, right? It must be some weird religious thing. But actually, there's fairly comparable evidence from other cultures that if you are a hunter, and it's not so far towards the poles that you have to wear clothes all the time because it's really cold, and it's not so far towards the equator that you never wear any clothes because it's too hot. So somewhere like Greece, or comparably the Plains Indians, so like the Cherokee, etc., that actually hunting nude is much better. You make less sound. You don't get caught on branches that might make a noise. And most importantly, it doesn't carry your smell. The most important thing for a successful hunt is not smelling like a person. So why then do they continue doing this? Well, when you move from hunting to farming, you might keep the same traditions. You don't wear clothes when you hunt. You might not remember why you do it anymore because it's been done for generations. That's just how it's done. So no clothes equals more food. So when you move to farming, no clothes equals more food. Okay, what does all this have to do with sport? When we look at the origins of sport, or the Olympic Games at least, we see some interesting things. The athletes, they cover themselves in oil. They wash themselves. They compete at events that are about physical strength and prowess. They fast beforehand. All of these things are things traditionally associated with hunting cultures. You fast beforehand because if your breath smells of meat, animals will smell it and flee you. You don't wear clothes to avoid them getting snagged. You cover yourself in oil and have a bath to get rid of every possible drop of human smell. These traditions are carried over in hunting practices. And so when you go on to continue to engage in behaviours that are heavily associated with hunting, you will continue in those same practices that have been handed down generation after generation, which goes a long way to explaining the origins of many of these Greek aspects. The exception perhaps being the nudity, because originally the Greeks had a belt that they got rid of at some point, so where the nudity came from is anyone's guess, really. And we can see this in the sports today, right? All of the rules are there for a reason, but they're also there as part of tradition. Sport is heavily ritualized. From the playing of national anthems, to the rituals that individual athletes do for good luck, to the rules which sort of make sense and sort of don't. Like, why in rugby you're not allowed to pass the ball forwards? Sure, it might be a different game, but you could do it very easily. So sport is a ritualization of behaviours, a codification of behaviours. Okay, so what about the sacrifice idea? Why is sport a sacrifice? Well, actually, again, if we look at the ancient Greeks, competitors were seen as sort of sacrifices. Olives were heavily associated with sacrifice. You would use olive oil to anoint something before you sacrificed it, and olive wreath crowns were the main prize for the Olympic Games. There was another games where if you competed and won, and then you competed another time and didn't win, they would execute you. They would just sacrifice you to the gods, because that's what you are as a competitor. You are a sacrifice. And every sport you engage in is a sacrifice in some way of energy and time. What Adam Peaty said in his interview after the breaststroke final.
A sacrifice of some sort. And that sacrifice can come in many ways. It can come in time, it can come in energy, it can come in relationships, it comes in every single form.
Final really struck me as reflecting this idea of every time a competitor goes out there, they are sacrificing their energy. And it might be for their country, it might be for themselves, it might be for their sport, or as in ancient times, it might be for their gods. But it is a sacrifice. And you cannot become a true sportsman without a lot of sacrifice. So there you have it. I think a really interesting idea of what is a sport, a ritualized sacrifice of human energy. If you thought that was interesting, please do give it a like and subscribe, as it helps other people find out about it. And why not see one of my other videos about the Olympics?